In this episode, we're going to hear 3 very weird and strange encounters. But before we get to the stories, I want to mention there are 2 new channels of mine that you should definitely check out. The first is Donovan Dread 2, where I release the same great content, just a little shorter in length. Then there's Dread Captures, where we analyze various encounters that were captured on video, that were sent in to us, or that are available online. So if you're digging my content, make sure to hit that subscribe button and I'll keep narrating these creepy encounters. Now let's get to the stories. This is a story that happened to me almost 30 years ago. Honestly, it's been so long that I nearly forgot all about it. I lived in Philadelphia at the time, but my uncle had a home that he purchased out in Chester County, about an hour away. Every weekend I would beg my parents to let me go stay with him. My uncle wasn't married and didn't have any kids. He genuinely enjoyed when I would come to visit. Most of the time, I would help him with his various projects around his considerable property. Or we would go fishing at the small lake that you could see from his back deck. It was on one such of these weekend trips that this story takes place. I was around 6 or 7 when it happened. My dad had dropped me off at my uncle's on a Friday after school and would be coming to pick me up on Sunday morning. Me and my uncle just hung out that night eating pizza and watching some scary movies that my parents would have never let me see. The next day after breakfast, my uncle said that he had some work to do in the basement and that it would take a while. He said that he didn't want me to help him because some of the building materials they used to build the old house might get me sick, so he told me to go outside and play. Times were different then, and his neighborhood, if you could call it that, was very quiet and safe. There were no other neighbors nearby really, and the only other house in sight was this really old ramshackle of a house across the lake. So I was messing around outside for about a half an hour when I saw somebody standing down by the lake. It was a few hundred feet down from the house, and there was a dirt path that led from the back of the property to the shoreline. The figure waved to me to come down, and not knowing any better, I walked down to meet them. The person waiting for me by the lake was an extremely old woman. Granted, when you're a kid, everyone seems old. I couldn't tell exactly, but she was probably one of the oldest people that I've ever seen. And this is where things got a little hazy. I have a vague memory of a woman telling me she had a lot of nice toys on the other side of the lake, and she wanted to take me to see them. But in order to get there, we would have to walk across the lake. Finally, I remember holding her hand. The next thing I have a concrete memory of is my uncle holding me and walking with me back up the trail to the house, my clothes soaking wet. He was asking me why I was standing in the lake, and he seemed kind of upset at me. We got to the house and my uncle got me a change of clothes and let me get dressed. When I was done, he was waiting for me at the table and asked to explain myself, so I did. He let me finish my story, listening very intently as I told it. When I was done, he asked me questions about the old lady, only I couldn't remember any details about her at all. It was weird, because she was literally right next to me, but it was like trying to recall any specific features about her pushed the memory farther away. After all that, my uncle told me that he came out of the house to check on me and saw me standing about 10 feet into the lake, the water almost above my shoulders. There was no old lady. My uncle decided to pause his project and we spent the rest of the day just hanging out. My parents picked me up the next day, and that was the end of it. I went back a bunch more times but never saw that old woman again. My uncle didn't really let me out of sight either though. So why am I telling this story now? My uncle is one of those guys blessed with eternal youth. 30 years later, and he still has enough energy to swing a hammer and dig in his garden. And now I'm a father myself, my son having recently turned 7 years old. The memories of that day have long receded. I decided it would be good for my son to get out of the city and spend some time with my uncle. My son had been there twice, but never without me, and never for an entire weekend. So we made the arrangements. Friday after school, I dropped him off for the weekend with my uncle, just as I had done when I was a kid. I talked to him the next morning, and all seemed well, and I told him I would call him again later. I got a call from my uncle around 5 p.m. He assured me that my son was fine, but I needed to come pick him up right now, and he would explain when I got there. I made the 90-minute drive in just under 60 minutes. When I got there, I could instantly see that my son was okay, and he told me that he wanted to stay. My uncle told me to step outside with him so we can talk. See, a few years after my incident at the lake, my uncle had heard a legend from a local that he became friends with. The local had told him that in the early 1940s, a family used to live in that old abandoned house across the lake, a husband and a wife and their son of 10. When World War II broke out, the husband was drafted and ultimately died on Omaha Beach. The woman was now alone with her son and was suffering from the death of her husband. Over the following year, her mental health deteriorated rapidly, and at one point, a span of weeks had passed without anyone seeing either her or her son. When the local sheriff went to check in on her, he found both her and her son's bodies floating in that same lake, bloated and waterlogged. They had been there for weeks. The son's hands and legs had been tied with thick rope. The investigation never turned up any clues as to how they died in the lake. My uncle had told me all of this, and then he told me why he had called. Earlier that day, he sat down on the couch for a few minutes just to rest, and had accidentally fallen asleep. My son, being too kind to wake him, decided to go outside for a little bit and entertain himself. My uncle said he woke up in a panic. He couldn't explain why. After seeing my son wasn't in the house, he went out to the back door onto the deck to find him. He spotted him wading into the lake, the water already at his chest. He raced down to the water and dove in just as my son dipped below the surface. He was able to pull him back to the shore. He said my son was dazed, like he really wasn't there. But after taking him back to the house and drying him off, my son slowly came around. He asked my son what had happened. My son told him the exact same story I had almost 3 decades ago, that an old woman had beckoned him into the lake's edge, took his hand, and walked him into the water. There wasn't much else to say to each other. Not in the mood for speculation or conversation. I simply just sat beside my son for a good while, until I decided that we should get home. I never asked him about the incident, and he never offered anything up, almost like he had forgotten it. My son hasn't and won't be back to my uncle's house. It's not his fault, of course. He's a wonderful guy, and I don't hold any of it against him. It's just, whatever we experienced, whatever that lake or that lady is, it's unnatural. A ghost, a demon, an entity, I don't know. I'm only sharing this story as a warning to other parents. Something sinister exists in this world, something evil and wretched. Just be safe and keep your children close. My family used to own a big acreage in a remote part of eastern Tennessee. There's a big fishing pond and a stream that runs through it. During the summer, I used to leave my fishing lines out at night to catch the big catfish we had. You had to go through some real thick patches of woods to reach the pond. There were a couple of game trails I would use. I would drive the trail entrances from the house and walk about a half a mile with my gear. I would just use a headlamp for a light. I did that pretty often and pulled a lot of catfish out of that pond. This one night that I'm talking about, I got down to the area just before sunset. It had been raining some earlier, so the trail was a little muddy. About halfway to the pond, I saw what seemed to be a really big footprint. I wasn't used to seeing any footprints but my own, let alone huge ones like that. I put my boot into one of the imprints, and it was about twice as long and twice as wide as my foot. It seemed to have 4 toes, but the depth of them is what got me. Whatever made that had to be really heavy. There were only 2 of them, like whatever it was had just briefly crossed the trail, then headed back into the brush. All kinds of things ran through my mind, but there was no logical explanation that I could think of. It made me feel really uneasy, though. It was just about 9 o'clock, and I needed to check the lines, so I went the rest of the way to the pond. While I was pulling up one of the lines, I heard this loud splash. I assumed it was just a fish jumping. I kept on with what I was doing. There was a pretty good haul that night. I was just about done when I started hearing this low, guttural groan. And the sound kept multiplying, like there was more than one animal, or whatever they were. To me, it sounded like they were having a fight. The noise was coming from across the pond. Then I started hearing a lot of loud splashes, and my imagination started going wild. I'm thinking whatever it was might be in the water swimming toward me. I was used to hearing an animal out there on occasion, but not more than one at a time. That's what was really freaking me out. I couldn't imagine what I was up against. Then I heard a loud crash in the woods, just yards away to my left. My adrenaline jumped. I started to feel panicky. All I had for a light was the headlamp, so it was hard to get my visual bearings on what was happening. At this point, whatever was making those sounds was behind tree cover. I'm standing there trying to figure out what to do, and then the woods just broke out in the wildest, loudest sounds of fighting. You can't imagine it. Snarling and howling, and these ungodly yelps and whooping noises. Then I'm suddenly hit with this incredible stench, like the wind shifted or something, and all I could smell was rotten garbage. I just dropped my gear and started running down the trail toward my truck. The smell was getting worse, and I thought I could hear footfalls coming from behind me, but it could have just been my paranoia. I felt so exposed, I decided to veer off toward the hunting blind my dad had built. It was closer than my truck, and I wanted to get some height between myself and this situation. The blind was about 6 feet high. I scrambled up there and immediately felt better, even if it was just psychological. I felt like I had a better advantage. Unfortunately, I had no gun with me. I had never had anything like that going on while I was just minding my own business and grabbing some fish. Everything seemed to have gotten quiet. I looked out toward the trees. The moon was barely half full and I was straining to see. I stayed completely quiet and just kept watching. Then, something big came into view from the cover of the trees, and then another one stepped out. I just about lost control of my bladder. Two huge creatures with great big shoulders and chests. My best guess was they were about 7 or 8 feet tall. One was a little shorter than the other. They were covered in this thick hair but were walking upright. The faces seemed to not have hair on them. They reminded me of some type of giant ape but different. More like a caveman, but so tall. Then the bigger one whipped around and lifted its arms up and started screaming and howling at the other one. The smaller one took a step back into the woods, and I decided to haul ass out of there while they were fighting with each other. I got home and locked every window and door and grabbed a gun, and stayed up half the night watching for anything to approach. I was at the house alone. Everyone else was gone for the summer, and I was caretaking the place. I called my dad the next day, and he didn't know what to think. He just sort of laughed it off. I was pretty sure he wouldn't be laughing if he'd seen that in person. I spent days dwelling on what could have been going on there. Was it some kind of territorial dispute between those creatures? What in the actual hell could they be? I was even checking the news to see if anything had escaped from the zoo, but there was nothing. No information at all. I should have never gone to the woods late at night. I regret what I saw. I can't get anyone else to believe me when I tell them what I saw. So I'm hoping I could reach someone else with my story that went through something similar. I live in the infamous town called Salem in Massachusetts. Almost all of us have heard of the Salem witch trials. In fact, that's what my town is known for. I wish my story involved witches instead. It would be a lot easier for me and more believable. Anyways, now that you get an idea where I live, let me tell you what happened on the night of July 13th of this year. I decided to go out with a few of my friends and we drank. We were in the middle of the woods just having fun. We had a nice bonfire going. I think it was around 1 or 2 in the morning when we all decided we were going to pack up and stumble back home. Well, I was one of the people who didn't have as much to drink as the rest, and my house was only a few blocks away from the entrance of the woods that we were in, so I was fine walking by myself. As I was following the trail to the entrance of the woods, I saw something staring at me behind a tree. I thought it was one of my buddies that decided it would be funny to prank me, so I played along and pretended to be scared. I thought I heard him say something, but then I looked more closely at them, and I realized I didn't know who was in front of me. The eyes were popping out of their sockets almost. The mouth was curled into this malicious smile. I could see something popping out of its head. This was not anywhere near Halloween, so I don't know why someone would have any sort of costume on at this time of year. I just stood there and froze. I didn't know what to do. Whoever it was behind the tree started to come out, and before I got a better look, I made a break for it and ran. I don't know where I was running to, but I ended up at the entrance to the woods. I stumbled into a few friends of mine that were also making their way back to their houses. I didn't want to run into whatever it was in the woods earlier, so I just made my way home and into my bed. When I got into bed, I was thinking I was just seeing things because I had a little too much to drink. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I really didn't even have that much to drink. Sure, I was a little lightheaded, but I was still able to talk to my friends, and I was able to walk just fine. I was pretty clear-minded. When I went to sleep, though, the weirdest thing happened to me. I dreamt I was still in the woods in front of this thing that I saw earlier. But this time, I wasn't able to move. It slowly stepped out from behind the tree and walked towards me. It didn't talk, but I thought I could hear it say something in my head. I just heard the word suffer over and over again. It was in a deeper voice, but yet it felt like it was screaming at me. It felt like my head was going to explode with how the thing talked. It looked human, except for whatever it was on top of its head. I woke up after it was face to face with me and it opened its mouth. That morning, I texted some of my friends and asked them if they saw me in the woods and decided to play a prank on me. Nobody knew what I was talking about. That was 3 months ago. I still see the person or thing or whatever was in my dreams. I dreamt I woke up before with it in my bedroom doorway, and it started hissing at me while smiling. I started having these strange marks on my arms and my body about 2 months ago. I don't own any animals, mind you, and I stopped drinking since. No one believes me, not even my family. They think that they're self-inflicted wounds, and when I tell them they're not, they just don't believe me. No matter what I tell anyone, they just think I'm crazy. I keep having these dreams or whatever it is, and then I wake up with a cut or even a bruise on part of my body. Wherever the thing marked me, I woke up with it. What do you think this is? Am I going insane? Or was I not supposed to run into whatever was in the woods? I'm afraid to close my eyes at this point. I just need someone to believe me. Someone to save me from whatever is going on. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you think of these stories in the comments below. Don't forget that you can listen to my episodes on any of your favorite podcasting platforms. I try to upload every single day on this channel and on Donovan Dread too, where I release shorter content. Same great encounters, just a little bit shorter. Also, if you want to see crazy encounters captured on trail cams, then check out Dread Captures. It's part of the Dread Network, where we go over live footage of very strange encounters that are sent into the Facebook group or videos that are circulating on the web. Last but certainly not least, check out Lilith Dread. She releases the same great content daily on her channel. You'll find all of these links below. Thanks and take care.